I'm Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. In part 2 of my look at the menus in the Leica Q3, we'll be looking at the video settings and also take a bit of a deeper dive into some of the settings that work for both photo and video. Okay, looking at the camera, let's make sure that the picture's nice and sharp, and I'll flip it over so that we can see the menus on the back. There we go. All right, now let's go to the autofocus settings, and I'm in photo mode at the moment. So these work for both video and for stills. The autofocus system works the same for both, but the settings are important and there are some subtleties between them which I'll point out to you in a sec. So let's go into the focusing option on page 1 and click right. We've got focus mode, which I did mention. We've got single shot, which obviously is useful for stills and locking the focus, and then we've got continuous, which is when the camera tracks the movement, and it does that in various different ways. So let's right click here. There's the two options there. Intelligent AF, I tend to leave this one alone because it chooses continuous or stills depending on the subject. I think I'd rather make that decision. So I'm going to leave it on S for the minute, AFS for the minute. Then we're going to go down to AF mode. So at the top we have multi-field. I think I would never use this one. It picks the focusing point for you, and I think you need to be choosing the focus point yourself, because focus is where the viewer's direction is drawn to, and it's your creative choice what is the subject that the camera should be focusing on. So leave that one out of the list. Spot, brilliant sometimes for portraits in stills mode. Now I'm going to be talking a bit about video and stills in this video, this particular video about the menus, because some of the features do overlap between the two capabilities of the camera. So let's just talk generally for the moment. So spot is not going to be very useful for video because if something moves and that spot ends up on a different part of the subject or the background of something, it's going to refocus, so it'll be quite twitchy. But for stills, for photo, it's brilliant for portraits because you can absolutely nail that eye. Now you might say, why not use the new face detect eye detection? Well, absolutely you can do that, but sometimes you want precision and a lock on something. So if you're using AFS and you're using the spot function, you can nail that focus. It's just a narrower sensor portion for the camera to focus on. That's all it's doing. It's just a smaller area. I use it rarely, but occasionally I've found it absolutely indispensable. Field is the box that you see in the middle of the screen there. That is a field, and you can make it bigger and smaller. I'm pretty sure I talked about this in the other video, by pinching and spreading your fingers. You can see it going bigger and smaller there. That's the bigger field. I quite like that because it does have a little bit of versatility. You don't want it to be too focused like the spot, and you don't want it to be too broad like the multi-field. So your mileage may vary, as they say. Try and change it if you find it's not working for you. Personally, I find the larger box works quite nicely. So the zone focusing, you can see the symbol is changed there, gives you this array of crosses on the back of the camera. Now, this can be very useful if you're photographing something that's moving very quickly, because if you're photographing with, say, the 100 to 400 lens and you're trying to photograph a bird in flight, it's going to be all over the viewfinder because it's very, very hard to keep a tight shot on something that's moving quickly. If you use the zone focusing system here, it will pick whichever of those points is on the subject, and it gives you a lot more opportunity to capture something in fast movement. So I tend to use that quite a lot for birds in flight, and it seems to work really well. AFC and zone focusing. Again, all cameras' autofocus systems have their own idiosyncrasies, and sometimes one combination works better than another in certain circumstances. So it's highly recommended to try out the different options, the different combinations of options on a subject and see which works best for you. All right, back to the focusing. So that's zone. Whoops, let's go back to that. AF mode. Tracking. Tracking's a tricky one. You have to lock a small box onto the subject. So you put the box over the subject, you press the shutter button, it will lock, and then the focus should stay on that subject as it moves around. Now I find it works great for things that are moving laterally, not moving towards you or further away from you, depending on the subject. If it's moving quickly away or quickly towards you, you're better off with one of the other settings. But something that's moving subtly and around the screen, it works really well. It's not something that I've used very commonly. I find the word tracking is a little misleading. It doesn't track in 3 dimensions. It seems to track better in 2 dimensions laterally as opposed to forwards and backwards. So the phase detect system, which we'll come to in a sec, has almost completely replaced this as an option as far as my use is concerned. Then we've got the last two, which is eye, face, body detection and eye, face, body and animal detection. Now, I can't honestly say I've used the animal detection yet. I haven't had an opportunity to photograph any animals, but what I can tell you is that the eye body option works really well. And in the first look video I did, I give you an example, which I'll show you now, of how those little yellow boxes pop up on the subject's eyes, and you can even choose which one to actually pick. If you've got someone looking at you at a slight angle, it might pick up both eyes. You can just use the little arrows on the back to switch between them. A little bit fiddly. To be honest, it usually picks the nearest eye anyway, so I've never had to adjust it, but you do have that option. And then when something's a bit further away, it will pick the head, and then a bit further away again, it'll pick the body. This works superbly in autofocus continuous, particularly for video. That's what it's designed for. Absolutely use it for stills, but I've found that maybe it's a muscle memory thing from my background. I'm used to me controlling the focus, so I tend to use the field focus and single shot for my stills, but for the video I've had a lot of success. In fact, quite recently filming people, I was doing a shot walking backwards tracking somebody, and I wanted to keep their face nice and sharp, so I put it on autofocus body, eye, face detect, and it held that focus beautifully. So yeah, really works well. Okay, so that's the AF modes. I'm generally leave the camera set on field by default. Focus assist was something else that somebody asked about. There's a few options here. This is basically when you go into manual focus and you take the lens off AF and go into manual focus, when you move the focusing ring. So if I take this off autofocus now, and hopefully you can see there it's on autofocus, or off autofocus, and I'm now manually focusing here. When you move that focusing ring, it will automatically magnify the scene, just like on the SL2 and on the M. You can magnify the scene in the viewfinder on the SL2 and on the rear screen on the M, and it will give you the option to critically focus on something. So very elegant. Doesn't happen obviously when you're in autofocus because it's kind of redundant. Then you've got focus assist, focus peaking. That gives you a very subtle red overlay over edges that are the sharpest part of the picture. It's looking for contrast. So the most contrasty parts of the picture will have a little tiny red fleck around them. It can be very subtle, but it's there if you look for it. It's not this great big overlay. It's not terribly obvious, but it's there if you are looking for it. Some say it's a little too subtle. I think it works fine once you get used to it because it's very precise, and that's the key. The peaking sensitivity gives you some control over that. I leave that on medium. I find that works fine. You can experiment with the other two as well, but I found medium, the default, works beautifully. So that's what that setting does. Another question I had was about display settings. So this is on page 5. If I go into this, you have some interesting settings here. Most of them I leave alone on default, but that top one, EF LCD Auto, there is an option there which you might choose to change if you're wanting to eke out the battery life. You can have it on LCD only. You can have it on automatic, which means it will change from the LCD to the viewfinder depending on whether the camera's down or up to your eye. So as soon as you put the camera to your eye, like that, it will trigger the EVF, which is really quite cool. Then the other option, come back to there, EVF, so the bottom one, let's just finish the simple options, is EVF only, so no LCD screen on the back. It's fairly obvious if you change them, you'll see how the camera behaves. But EVF extended is interested because it will use the EVF only and only when your eye is at the viewfinder. So the LCD is off, the EVF is off, but as soon as you give the camera to your eye, it turns on the EVF. So really good for longer battery life. And if you are struggling with battery life, you're shooting for a long time and you want to eke out the last little bit of battery life, that is a good power saving technique to use. So that's what that's for. There was another comment that one of the viewers on the last video made, was that when you're shooting in crop mode, if you set the camera to DNG and JPEG, then when you see the preview of the shot in the viewfinder after you've taken it, if you shoot DNG only, you see the entire picture. If you shoot DNG plus JPEG, or JPEG only, you will see the cropped version in the viewfinder afterwards, which is really, really useful. When you open the raw file into Lightroom, you will see the cropped version, but then when you go to the crop tool, you will see the camera's crop and the full image itself, so you can uncrop it. So that's really quite useful. Okay, let's go into video mode. So I'm going to swap across to video mode there. And you can immediately tell that you're in video mode when you see at the top of the screen the audio meters moving, because as soon as you make any noise at all, you will see those meters go up and down. It's a really good clue. The layout of the screen is much the same, but there are a few different things here that like it says at the top, on the top left there, all I 10 bits SD. I'll explain what that means in a sec. And then next to it says 4K 50 frames per second. The rest of it is more or less the same. Oh, of course, this one, L-log. We'll talk about that as well. So let's go into the menus. And there are a few differences. So let's start at the top and go through focusing. Well, we've been through focusing. All of these work the same in video as in stills, so we don't need to go through that again. One thing, of course, that we do need to talk about is the actual video format, resolution and settings. So let me just go through the video format and resolution first. And there's quite a lot to choose from. I use the MOV wrapper, which is basically a codec wrapper. What that means I'm not going to go into right now because there's a lot of other stuff we can talk about with video. I'm just looking at the menu options that I use to give you some starting point when you first get the camera. There's a lot of subtleties in here and really don't have the time to go into all of them. Right now, I'm using the MOV format. You've got the option to choose from 8K down to full HD. So 8K is about 8,000 pixels wide, 4K is about 4,000 pixels wide, and full HD is about 2,000 pixels wide. So each one doubles. So 8K is a lot bigger than full HD. Now, there are some limitations. For instance, when you choose 8K, let's just do the normal HK, the C8K is ever such a slightly different proportion, by the way. So you will, for instance, if I go into C4K, you'll see that it's 4096 by 2160. That's the pixel dimensions of what you capture. But if you go into 4K, it's 3840 by 2160. So it's not quite as wide. I tend to use the bog standard 4K setting, but let me just go through them all and go through to let you know what the differences are. So in 8K, let's go to the correct one. So in normal 8K, 7680 by 4320. That's an awful lot of pixels, crikey. It's compressed in H.265 codec using the MOV wrapper. You're capturing 300 megabits per second, which is reasonable. It can capture more, you'll see in a second. It's capturing 422 bit depth to the HDMI, but it's capturing 420 in 10-bit to the SD card internally. So you can record to external recorder with this. Personally, the 10-bit is more important than the 422 or the 420. That's really subtle to do with really deep color technology. If you're shooting green screen, 422 will give you a better result, but if you're shooting normal outdoor video of just broad general stuff, 420, 422, you're not going to see much of a difference. The difference is only visible at the sort of in edge cases, let's say. 420 is fine, but what you want is 10-bit, because we're going to talk a little bit in a sec about shooting L-log, and you cannot or should not shoot in L-log mode in anything less than 10-bit. It really is going to work against you if you do that. I'll come back to that point in a sec. So you'll also see this LGOP business here. That is shooting a group of pictures, GOP, and the idea there is it uses less data on your card, so it's a more efficient storage rating. It takes a keyframe, and then each frame after that will measure the differences between the frames, and then another keyframe, and so on. That's not ideal, but it's really good when you're shooting an 8K video on a camera of this size, 2 SD cards. So it's just super, super efficient, but it does have its drawbacks. What I use is 4K. I shoot 50 frames per second. I'm shooting all I, which means each frame is its own individual image. And that can be really good if you want to take stills off it later, and it can have implications for editing later on. I'm shooting 422 10-bit to the SD card. So that seems to me to be the sweet spot for this camera, is shooting in 4K. And can you see 600 megabits per second? That's maxing out. That's a lot of data. So the quality that you're getting is really, really high here. The reason I shoot 50 frames per second is because very frequently I want to slow a clip down to smooth it out. And if you're shooting at 50 and you play back at 25, it makes the speed go at 50%. So things take twice as long to play and look smoother. It looks fantastic. If you're struggling for card space, you might shoot at 25, but my default is 50 because you never know when you might need to reduce that frame rate and to reduce the frame rate to get that smoother, slightly drifty look to something. So it works really well. So that is my sweet spot for video. There are some other options. You can shoot into ProRes, which is a far less compressed format. ProRes is a very good editing format. Shooting into H.265 or H.264 is great for capture because it's very efficient. It's not so good for editing. Now, I'm not going to go into detail of that, but ProRes could be really useful, but it only works in full HD. Now, I suspect people will be shooting mostly in 4K on this camera, and that's what I recommend them to do. You've also got an option to go to slow-mo, but again, it's only in 1080p and it's only in H.265. You can't shoot L-log either in that mode. But if you want to slow something down to from 120 frames a second to 25, which is about 4.5 times, then you might want to choose this. For me, the absolute sweet spot is 4K, 50 frames per second. That gives beautiful results. Now, video settings, let's go into those. Microphone gain is a little bit irrelevant because you just won't be using the microphone on this camera for serious recording. It's very high quality, but because it's on the camera itself, it's not ever going to be ideally placed for recording anything like voice or so on. Great for ambient. If you're in a rainforest and you've got rustling of leaves and birds tweeting, this will record really good sound, but you've only got to just touch the camera slightly and get a little hissing, little scratchy noise. So you could use it as a recorder, but you're probably not going to use the sound that it records for much production stuff. This camera will take an external microphone in the future. The connection is here. It's definitely on the roadmap to be added later on. I can't say exactly when, but it will be added in the future, and that does transform it. But what you can do is record the sound on the camera as a reference track so that your externally recorded sound can be synchronized later. So if you have an external recorder, like even a phone, and you microphone somebody up with a wireless microphone and record their voice, you'll pick up enough on the camera so that when you come to your editing, you can take your unsynchronized externally recorded sound and synchronize those two together so you have perfect lip sync. It's actually really easy, so don't ever be put off by the idea that you're not recording synchronized sound. It's not necessary, and in fact in many cases in the movie industry and the documentary industry, they don't record synchronized sound. It's too difficult, too many wires required sometimes, and maybe not reliable enough. They record sound externally. The recording in the camera is not ideal. Recording on a dedicated sound recorder is going to give you much better results. So the idea of not having an external microphone connection here is a lot less significant than you might think. It is very convenient, and I am looking forward to it being fitted later on, but bear in mind that it's not super critical to the job in hand. But leave the microphone on because you will get a reference track. With noise reduction, we're not using the sound that's recorded necessarily, and wind noise reduction is not something that's very easy to do in software, which is what would be happening in here. That's why you have those big fluffy things on microphones to stop the wind making that rumbling noise. So no wind noise reduction is going to make much difference here. I'll move past this for a moment. Whoops, I'm going to turn that off. Oops, there we go. Turn that off for a second. That allows me to show you the other options: video style, video looks, and automatic dynamic range or intelligent dynamic range. Think in terms of shooting video as shooting a series of JPEGs, and all of the limitations of JPEGs apply. So anything that you do with a style or a look or automatic dynamic range will be baked into that JPEG. So it's exactly like shooting JPEG stills. Okay. I don't use any of that, and I would recommend that you do learn how to shoot in the low contrast L-log mode, which will give you much more professional results. So let's just go into video gamma, and hybrid log gamma is what it says. It's hybrid log gamma. It's halfway between normal contrast and super low contrast. And to me, it could be useful. It could be useful, but you'd have to have a pretty good reason to use it. If you're going to do anything other than just record simple video in camera and you want something more professional, you might as well just use L-log and grade accordingly. So let's talk about L-log. I can choose it there, and then there are some settings for it which I would leave alone. The L-log sharpness is already set to -2. That's exactly where I would recommend it to be. You can apply a custom LUT, which is a lookup table, and that corrects the very flat and very boring looking log gamma mode recording into something more like you're going to end up with. And if you have a particular custom style that you've created a LUT for in other software, you can copy that into the camera and have it convert so that the image you see on the screen is more like your final result rather than that somewhat horrible low contrast and lacking in color view that you get when you set the camera to L-log. Because I mean, it's amazing how bad the L-log mode looks on the back of the camera, and yet how much information you can pull out of it later. It's not like shooting RAW, but it's pretty close. That's where you'd choose the custom LUT. Now, I'm not going to go into custom LUTs, but I do know that there are limitations on the LUTs that you can create, something to do with the cube level, the number of it's a matrix, 8 by 8, 16 by 8 by 8 by 8, 16 by 16 by 16, or 32 by 32 by 32, three-dimensional volume of color. Wow, I know. I think there was a limitation of 16 cube for this one, but that would be something we'd have to look at the specifications for. To be honest, I am quite comfortable interpreting the view on the back of the camera because I know that I'm going to squeeze that color out of the recording later, and if it looks a bit bleh at the time, it doesn't bother me. The only thing that you must do and really seriously pay a lot of attention to is getting the right white balance when you record. So just coming out, just to mention that, I'll go into the menus and we'll go into white balance, and you see here it's set to 4600K, not daylight, not tungsten or whatever. That's because I often use my video light set to 4600 or whatever you choose, but you can specify in the menus a specific color temperature. So there's all your normal ones, daylight, etc. You can choose a gray card, which means you film a gray card and then you can sample from that gray card. That's great if you want to, time consuming. Or if you are using lights, or you know what the color temperature is, you can set a Kelvin value depending on what you're shooting. It goes up to pretty high and it goes down to really very, very low, which is like super, super warm. I'm using it on 4600 at the moment because the job I just did involved me using my lights, and my lights are adjustable in terms of white balance, and 4600 was the correct one to use at the time. So that's very, very useful, but do pay attention to your white balance when filming video. You can correct it later, but it's a lot better if you get it pretty close first time. Okay, so back to those video settings. I think we've talked about all of those. Yeah, that's everything we need to know. All right. Okay, so that's the video settings. So we've talked about the video settings, we've talked about the video resolution, we've talked about some of the menu settings that I didn't cover in the first video, a little bit of a deeper dive. I think that covers everything. Anything I haven't mentioned basically means that I'm leaving it on default in the camera. That's up to you to have a poke around and see what works better for you, but I've found that the things that I've not mentioned, leaving it on default has worked well for me. Okay. Thank you very much for listening. I think that covers everything. I'm sure there'll be somebody in the comments will point something I've missed, but like I said, leave it on default and you won't go too far wrong.